I'd like to invite the kids to come join me on the rug because, or anyone else who wants to, we're going to watch a little play, a little enactment by our very own and lovely and wonderful Phil Porter. And so I'm inviting the kids to have an upfront and special seat to this, to watch it with me, and to pay close attention because after Phil tells the story, I'm going to ask you what it was you noticed, what really stood out for you from the story. And I'm going to ask all you all that too, so be ready. Without further ado.
So the story this morning, it's so interesting because you think the story is about one thing and it turns out to be about another, and most of the people get it wrong about what's the most important part of the story. So here's how it goes. Jesus was out with his disciples. They were taking a walk through the village, and they came along a man who was sitting by the side of the path, and he was blind. And it was clear that he had been sitting there for a long time. And the disciples, now this is kind of interesting. Here's this whole crowd of people. Here's this guy sitting by the side of the road. The disciples say, well, let me ask you this. Jesus, answer this question. Is this man blind because he's a sinner or because his parents are a sinner? And you know that the story is going wrong at that moment. And this guy could hear him. It's kind of like, when you're in the hospital and the doctors come in on rounds and they're all talking about you over it. And the man sitting there, he's not deaf. And Jesus said, you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking, what could be done in this situation? Okay, and here's the best part from a kid's point of view. He spat on the ground in some dust, and he made a little bit of mud and paste. You can just kind of imagine spitting on the ground, making a little paste. And he took the paste and he put it on the blind man's eyes. He took that muddy paste that he had made from his own spit, and he put it on the man's eyes. And then he said, go wash in this pool. It's called the Pool of Siloam. Just go wash it off. And so the man did that. He went to the pool, he washed it off. And he could see. He could see. He was blind, but then he could see. That should have been the headline for this story. Blind man can see. But that's not where it ends. That's not what happened. So here's what's happened after the story. This man can see. Well, first of all, the people in the village, all y'all around who have seen this man sitting by the road, suddenly everyone's not sure it's the same guy. Now, wait a minute. The guy I saw by the sidewalk couldn't see. Is this the same guy? Oh, no, it just looks like the guy who couldn't see before. There's another guy who can see, but he just looks like the guy who couldn't see. So there were all these people even debating whether this was the blind man to begin with because, well, if he was blind, he can't see now. It must not be him. And the man said, well, this guy came by and and I watched and so the people hauled him to the Pharisees. Okay, the Pharisees always have a bad rap in the Bible, pretty much. They were the religious lawyers. And this is important because the Jewish people, it was so important for them to follow the law. This was so much of the practice. And one of the things was that Jesus had done this on the Sabbath. It was like he had done it on a Sunday for us. The Sabbath is not on a Sunday, but he had done it on kind of the holy day when you're not supposed to do any work. And so that was a problem. And then there was this other question about, well where did this man's power come from? Did it come from God, or was he some sort of imposter? And they started to grill this poor guy. What happened? Who did this? And was this a thing of God or what? And they were just getting all bent out of shape. And the man said, a guy came by, he spat on the ground, he put this on, I could see, I went to the pool, I can see. And so then the Pharisees hauled in his parents. And they said, is this your son? Is this your son who was blind before? He can see now, but he was blind before. And his parents said, well, he is our son. He was blind. It seems like now he can see, but that's all we know about it. And they said that because they were afraid. Because if the Pharisees decided that there was something wrong with this, they risked being kicked out of the community. So even though their son could see, they were afraid because something might happen to them. And so the man went off, and Jesus heard, after the thing with the parents, actually they started asking him more questions. And because he couldn't quite satisfy them with their answers, and because they were not convinced that this act was an act of God, they threw him out of the temple. And Jesus heard that. And he found the man, and he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And this guy, who had been blind before, said, "Well, show me the guy, show me the Son of Man, and I will worship him." And Jesus said, "Well, I was the one who helped you see." And the man said, "Oh, yes, now I recognize your voice." And he was so deeply grateful. He was so changed that he was ready to follow Jesus wherever he might go. And Jesus said to him, "This is why I came into the world. I came into the world to go to places where people couldn't see and to make them able to see, to bring light where there was darkness." And even as he said that, the Pharisees heard him say it, and they said, the Pharisees are still. The Pharisees, "Are you saying that we're blind? Are you saying that we're blind?" And Jesus said, "If you really were blind, there would be an excuse for you. But the fact that you're not really makes you responsible for what you see and what you don't see." It should have been, "Man blind, now can see." But instead it was, "Man was blind, now can see. Everyone is confused."
So, what did you notice about the story? Yeah. That it was magical. Something happened because he was blind and now he can see? Yeah. What else did you notice? What about all of you? What did you notice?
The hardest part of changing can be your community isn't ready for it.
Community. What else? What strikes you or stays with you about this story in this telling? Yeah, wait. Jesus spat on the ground? It was surprising to you. Yeah, absolutely. Jesus got dirty. Totally. Spits. Why the mud? It's interesting, little tidbit about the mud. It's one of the 39 things. Making mud is one of the 39 things you were prohibited from doing on the Sabbath. So perhaps to reinforce that point. What else? Anything else come up for you, particularly in line with our Lent theme of Saved by Hope? Hope. You want to say more about that? You keep on asking. Yeah. Keep asking the question, yeah. For me, definitely, the thing that comes up in this story for me is, as Phil says, it should be about the miracle, the transformation that happens with the man. But the thing that shows up for me again and again in this story is not the miracle, but the reaction to the miracle. The resistance. It's incredible how much investment and resistance there is. The questioning and judging and denying and distancing that everybody does in the story, the neighbors, the parents, and for sure the Pharisees. This cannot possibly be true. And the poor man, I think he's asked to tell his story 4 or 5 times in this chapter of John. And he tells the same story, and he becomes a little bit more sure about what happens, but the more he tells the story, the more entrenched in resistant the Pharisees become, the more panicked they become, the more arrogant they become. There's one point where they say to him, the man says, why do you keep asking me, do you want to be Jesus' disciple? And they say, you're his disciple. We're disciples of Moses. We know that Moses comes from God, but this man who you say made you put this mud on your eyes, we don't know where he came from. And the man says, it's astonishing to me. It's astonishing. I was blind, now I see. And you don't know where this comes from. It is astonishing, their resistance. But since we're talking about metaphors relating to eye and sight, I'm going to use another one from the gospel and take the log out of my own eye before I look at the speck in the Pharisee's eye. Because if I'm honest, there is resistance in me. There are so many times, more times than I would like to admit, to confess, where I am reluctant to believe a message because of the messenger. When I am resistant to changing a practice that has been a source of comfort and safety for me because of where it comes from, or it seems so radical, or it seems to threaten the places where I have come to know truth. Those exist in me. People for whom it's hard for me. People in my life and my family who, when they come towards me, I just think, ugh, and I shut off. Very difficult for me to believe that some truth, some insight could come from them. Political perspectives that are different than mine. Religious perspectives that are different than mine. Difficult for me. So it makes me have a little bit of compassion for the Pharisees, for their fear and resistance. Because really, what would they have had to give up? I mean, Phil talked about the parents. It was really true. It was really real that if they confessed that Jesus was who he said he was, they probably would have been cast out of the synagogue, which was the organizing structure, the place where they had safety. And for the Pharisees, it was where they had their power, where they had their identity. So sure, all of that stuff. But even more, I think, what was at risk is if they believed the blind man's story, they would have to entertain the possibility that Jesus was who he said he was. And even more, that God, that the God that Jesus came to talk about, that God was possible, which was a very different God than the God that the Pharisees understood and had known. The God of the Pharisees, at least in the Gospel of John, is a God of boundaries, of rules, of who is clean, who is not clean, of right and wrong, who is in and who is out. And with that God, they had developed all kinds of practices and beliefs and structures and rituals that kept them safe and secure. That God was safe. The God of Jesus, not so safe. That God is a God not of limits, but of possibility. A God who gets messy, as Weiwei said. A God who's willing to get in the muck of our lives and transform us. A God who is willing to go to the person who is outcast, the person who is other, the person for whom we don't want to hear the truth. And for progressive Christians, I feel like in some ways, we can understand that. There's all kinds of places where there's religious Christianity who haven't heard the truth, and we feel pretty good about, like, wow, we can hear the truth from queer people, from gay people, clearly, from women, from young adults. We're doing pretty well. But what about those brothers and sisters who come from a more fundamentalist understanding of our faith? What about when my uncle, who I love, but who is on the very right side of the political spectrum, much more conservative religiously than me, what about that? This text is challenging us, challenging me, to see God working through those people and in those people. And to be willing to entertain that there might be something in my life, in our life, that is getting in the way of us hearing the truth, the insight that they might have, limiting us from seeing God doing the works that God is doing in the world. This text is particularly challenging, I think, to those of us who are leaders or in positions of authority or responsibility, who have stuff on our shoulders, parents, teachers, business folk. Because, to lead is to choose. To lead is to decide. To lead is to say, this is the right course of action. We can gather all the information, but we need to decide. It's to set up systems that work. We don't want wishy-washy leaders. And yet this text says it is exactly the places where we feel sure, where we feel certain, where we know this is the right course of action. It's exactly those places where we're invited to say, like the Pharisees, are you calling us blind? It's exactly those places where we feel the need to move forward with our notion of what is right, that we are called to deep humility, that we might be wrong, or at least what we see might be partial. It's uncomfortable. But I don't think the texts we're given in Lent are there to make us comfortable. I think Lent is a time for us to journey with Jesus into the wilderness, to be willing to walk towards those places that disrupt our lives, that help us to see where it is that our current perspectives and views, patterns, keep us from God, as opposed to drawing us into God. In some ways, this story is profoundly sad. This amazing thing happened to this man who's been blind from birth. He was transformed. And instead of celebrating, he gets cast out. But I also think this story is profoundly hopeful. Because when he is cast out, Jesus finds him. And he is given new life, new community, new possibilities. And so it is with us. Those moments of resistance, those moments when we find ourselves judging, denying, categorizing, they're opportunities. Opportunities for us to notice that and to let it go. To choose curiosity rather than defensiveness. To choose wonder rather than cynicism. To choose new life, even if it seems as messy as spit in mud. May Lent be a time where we entertain the possibility that God is so much more than we can imagine. And when Easter comes, can we sing Amazing Grace? Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that came to someone like me, took the scales from my eyes, and made me see. Amen.